Thank you so much for joining us for our last activist in residence for the year. And it really is great delight to welcome Dr. Murdoch Stephens with us to be our last and final activist in residence for the year. So in many ways this is really welcoming one of our own, as Dr. Stephens has a PhD from the School of Communication, Journalism and Marketing with his work on social movements, activism and academia. It is particularly insightful to have someone who has navigated both academia and activism and lived in both these worlds. As we were talking, Murdoch, you were sharing how sort of academia offered you sustenance in doing some of your ongoing activist work. So it's really interesting to think about how these spaces actually come to converge and build bridges in that sense. Dr. Stephens is the editor of the publishing collective Lawrence and Gibson. He has a PhD on critical theory and climate change from Massey and was the driving force behind the Double the Refugee Quota campaign, which is what he will share with us today and throughout the week, including in the workshop, which is now government policy. So I think one of the things that will be really exciting to learn from you, Murdoch, is how do you actually go from change processes and then transform them into policy and embolden them into policy spaces. He has published dozens of opinion editorials, academic articles, book chapters, and he also has been working on novels. So Murdoch brings with us his critical and reflexive work, which connects with his literary work, which I find really inspiring in terms of the spaces between art, literature, and activism. His PhD focused on how 4 contemporary critical theorists have written of climate change. A version of that work was published as Critical Environmental Communication: How Does Critique Respond to the Urgency of Climate Change, in 2018 by Lexington. Now, the talk today is titled For Who, By Who? Reflections on Campaigning and Prospects for Refugee-Led Organizations in an Expanded Refugee Quota. I think this is really relevant, particularly with the question of voice, refugee voice and refugee ownership within the broader landscape of advocacy. So welcome, Murdoch, and looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Mahan. Whew. Right. This is my first time speaking on this topic, so I've got a notepad for myself to take notes, but I probably don't recommend that any of you take it. This stuff is quite newly formed. Reflections on the 5 years. I'm pretty sure it's 5 years. I at least tell the media it's 5 years the campaign took. It was June 20th, 2013 it began. Yeah, so thank you, Mahan. It's a pleasure to be here at the CARE Research Centre, and it's great to be back in Palmerston North. Visited a few times because Palmy's one of the, on a per capita basis, one of the leading resettlement cities in New Zealand, along with Nelson. Really, if the other smaller cities in New Zealand did the same amount, we would be catching up to some larger countries like Australia or Canada in our per capita intake of refugees. So yeah, it is kind of a new topic for me today. There is a video that some students made about my campaigning work, but I think I might just wait till the end to see if we have time to play it, because I think it'll be quite embarrassing for me to hear myself speaking a year ago. It's sometimes the hardest thing to live up to things you've said in the past, or just to hear yourself and watch your video. But they were students of mine at Massey when I was lecturing down in Wellington, and so I sort of did them the favor, I don't know, maybe they did me the favor of interviewing me. So there's sort of 2 components to what I'm speaking about today. I want to just give a little bit of a background on what a refugee quota is, what the campaign to double New Zealand's refugee quota was, what it is, what it was, and then to get into some of these questions about whose voices get heard, when we're speaking of and with and sometimes for refugees. And I'll talk a little bit about a government initiative from 2006 called Strengthening Refugee Voices, and how that has moved and changed and been cut back, and some of the potentials for similar or maybe different programs to come in the current political climate. So I really like this opening picture. This says a lot to me about New Zealand. This was part of our poster campaign announcing the tour I did around New Zealand last year. And Phantom bill stickers put up these posters for us. They always take a photo of the poster to tell you they actually did put the pictures up. There's something just lethargically New Zealand about this whole setup, with a coin save in the background and sort of slouching New Zealander or someone chewing on a chopper chop walking past as these sort of three, I don't even know what size those are, like A1, A0 posters are smashed against the wall with the red and the white and the blue colours. We'll revisit some of those posters a little later on. So a refugee quota is actually quite a unique system to provide refugee protection. Most of us in New Zealand, if we've heard anything about refugees, we'll think that, okay, a refugee quota is the way we provide protection to people in New Zealand. But it's actually the least common form of offering protection internationally. Usually the way that people get protection as refugees is they cross a border themselves, and if the country they go to has signed the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, then they have the right to ask that country to give them protection. So that's the asylum seeker process. If that country has signed it, then they have to have a system in place whereby they assess whether that person is legitimately persecuted or not. So all the people we saw going into Europe, into Germany, Sweden, and places like this in 2015 were all following the traditional asylum route. And that was perfectly legal to cross international borders because these countries had signed up to the UN Convention. So in 2015, Germany received, 800,000 to 1 million asylum applications. In New Zealand, in the same year, we received just over 300 asylum applications. So those are people who crossed the border into New Zealand by plane, came here and said, I am fearing for my life, I want protection from your country. So New Zealand only got 300 for a number of reasons. The primary one is we stop people getting on planes to come here if we don't think that they will leave, which is why it's so low. We would get far more if the borders were open for people to claim it. So we only got about 300 people. So through the asylum seeker, that's as an application, by the way, about 120 were accepted in 2015 through the asylum process, the same process everyone went into Germany with. Of those, another 50 were added to that what do they call that? Appeal. After appeals, more people get accepted. So the way to think of the refugee quota, sometimes we think of quotas as things that are limiting on people. They are restrictive. The quota, a better way to think of the quota is as a top-up to that asylum number, as a way for countries that are a long way away from conflict zones like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, for them to top up those asylum numbers that are much lower than. So you can imagine Germany is getting 800,000 people in 2015. They don't need a quota to top that up to a higher level so that they're doing their fair share. Whereas New Zealand, historically, has been fairly low numbers of asylum seekers because we restrict them, but also because they simply can't get here. So we think of the quota probably most effectively if we see it as a way for countries to live up to international expectations on the number of refugees they welcome in. So sometimes in radical circles we have the notion that we should get rid of all quotas on refugees, as if that would be a way to get rid of borders or allow more people to come in. But that doesn't quite capture the sort of supplementary notion of what the quota is. So I put that cartoon up because people love cartoons. I hope you can see it in Wellington. It's from 2015, Garrick Tremaine. Not always the best cartoonist on race in New Zealand, but here he's got John Key with a symbol of our refugee quota, saying to the people trying to get from Turkey into Greece, got a quota, love, try one of the others. So in 2013, I started a campaign. It's a very long backstory, which you can buy for the princely sum of $15 from Bridget Williams' books, to double New Zealand's refugee quota. It hadn't increased in 30 years. Our international ranking was around 90 at hosting refugees per capita, and Australia took, at that time, 5 times as many after adjusting for population. So the campaign was trying to get the first increase in 30 years to the quota. I've talked about this so much that I could just keep going. I'm not going to go into much more depth on it, but basically the aim of the campaign was to do our bit, to simply take a few more people. There's a whole lot of backstory about why I did that. Again, it's in the book. What else do I need to say about that? What was the Double the Quota campaign? I mean, it was a long process. Maybe I talk about it. Oh no, that's in the... So there's a workshop tomorrow where I go through talking about campaigning, and particularly focusing on the first year and a half and the 2014 election, where there was very little public interest in it, not a lot of media coverage, but it was the real set-up time for us being ready by 2015 for when the refugee crisis hit. We had a campaign in store. We had the Labour Party and the Greens listening to us. So I'll talk a bit about tomorrow and work with people who might have their own campaigns they're wanting to work on, talking through like how we might actually navigate some of those difficult early terrain periods of getting started and getting noticed. So I will do more of that in the workshop tomorrow, I think from 10 until 2. Strengthening refugee voices is the way that the government in the last 12 years has tried to have the voices of resettled refugee communities to be heard at a both national and a city council level throughout New Zealand. There were 4 organisations created. It was sort of led, my understanding is it was led out of Wellington, where a group called Changemakers was formed in 2001, but it wasn't actually institutionalised until 2006 when there was funding coming in by the third term of Helen Clark's Labour government. Basically, I don't know if y'all have been to many of the forums around refugee resettlement. One of the constant refrains is that refugee communities are not listened to by central government, whether that's the particular party that's in government or whether that's the Department of Labour, which turned into the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. There's a constant refrain that refugee voices aren't being heard. And so this was an attempt by a fairly mature political coalition by the Clark government in their third term to create these 4 institutions that would produce those voices, that would be community-led. I thought I changed that language in the 3rd bullet point. I'll get onto that in a second. So these were set up in Auckland, the Auckland Resettled Community Coalition, set up in Wellington, Changemakers Refugee Forum, also set up in Waikato and in Christchurch. And now there's also Manawatu Refugee Voices, who I'm going to chat to later today about their experience of forming and taking part in this Strengthening Refugee Voices group. So then as National went into their 2nd term, they reduced the funding by about 50% it was for Changemakers, cut the Strengthening Refugee Voices funding right back, which I'll get onto Changemakers in a minute, but really made kind of a crisis point for these organisations and changed what a lot of them were focusing on. So Changemakers is the one I'm most familiar with. I more or less live in Wellington now. It represents 15 refugee background communities around the Wellington region. So these sometimes align with the countries that refugees come from, but sometimes there's also different ethnic communities from within a country. And they will have their own sort of community voices that they're trying to have heard. It started in 2001, yes, incorporated in 2006. The primary function today is holding hui, both to get feedback from these 15 community groups, and then to have information forums to pass information from predominantly Immigration New Zealand, part of the MB, to the community members who are interested. They've also had successful funding and volunteering on teaching people to drive, which is one of the difficulties in trying to get employment, or at least one that's been identified. And historically, they used to conduct a lot more research. I think there were 2 research employees of Changemakers before it had their funding cut, about 2013. And in that work, they have to collaborate with, for the Hui, they have to collaborate with Immigration New Zealand. So part of their contract, and this is all fairly new material to me. I haven't worked in these organizations before. So I'm coming from a researcher background in this, but also someone who had a campaign focusing on the political side of the refugee quota rather than necessarily on the service provision. So I'm sort of coming into this now and listening to a lot more of these communities about some of the potentials and problems that they're finding, which I'll get onto a little bit later. I won't actually presage that now. So there are, of course, a series of other kind of sometimes formal, sometimes informal refugee voices around the country. There's a New Zealand Refugee Council. There's not a huge amount I can find on what they're doing at the moment. There's the New Zealand Youth Refugee Council, which is going from strength to strength, started about 3 years ago. I won't go into them too much either, but there's also an Asylum Seeker Support Trust based out of Auckland, providing hostel accommodation to asylum seekers when they get here, as opposed to the quota refugees. And then there are also refugee voices within the mainstream service providers, such as the Red Cross, such as some of the trauma counselling organisations. Political parties, we've seen some refugee voices, not just Skoris Kahraman from the Green Party, but we've also had candidates for Labour as well with refugee backgrounds. And then just other institutions, people who are working for MB, for example, from refugee backgrounds, take an interest in this area and are sometimes gone to as experts or community representatives. One of the struggles in the campaign for us was this sort of absence of the voice for the people who weren't in New Zealand, but who would be if we had a fair quota. So there was this sort of, because this is all about New Zealand, there's the people who, I always tried to frame this in kind of a difficult way, which I never really got my head around. But imagine if our quota had grown with our population since 1987, rather than staying stagnant. Who would those people have been? We don't know who those people are because they were never selected, but if they are probably in some other country now. And so the ability to give a voice to these people who were not selected, to this negation, to this lack, is kind of, well, from a critical theory background, kind of fascinating, but also a challenge in trying to represent people who aren't even selected to come to New Zealand. So there's not exactly a cohort of people in, say, Indonesia or Malaysia or Lebanon who have the notion in their head that they will get to New Zealand. They're just in this sort of general position where the UNHCR has said, well, yeah, you qualify as a refugee and also you're in great need of being resettled, but there's really no pressure from outside the country on us to take more people, especially from the people who would get resettled here. A lot of refugees know very little about New Zealand before they come here. Although, to be said, I get an email every week from someone in either a refugee camp or a refugee-like situation begging me to sponsor them to come in. So there are sort of, I hear these voices, but they don't have a prominent place in the discourse in New Zealand and the people outside the democracy. So in the specific Double the Quota campaign, it was really curious. It was very interesting. This first point was sort of what I was trying to make before, the sort of difference between people who are recognised by the UNHCR as potential refugees, people needing protection, compared to those who are actually resettled, who are already here, who in a sense are no longer refugees, who are resettled refugees or refugee background people, we might say. The first thing I had to do with the refugee background communities was in 2013, at the very start of the campaign. I talked to Changemakers Refugee Forum, And it was a really strong meeting. They put forward about 3 different things that I needed to meet if we would get not only not their support, but if they would not oppose the campaign. A lot of this was me coming in from the outside, having some experience overseas with refugees, with people who became refugees, but that didn't translate to a sense of trust within the New Zealand culture, which is totally justifiable. So I've had probably the best relationship with changemakers out of all the organisations, but then in 2014 they lost pretty much all of their staff and have been changing over CEO every 18 months since then. They have a board which is a little stronger because it is based in the local communities, but a lot of the work is the people doing research, the chief executives have moved. So at this point we had no support from these organisations, no public support saying, yes, we agree. We had private support. We had different members of these organisations saying, yes, we think the refugee quota should increase, maybe not double, but at least increase. A lot of this changed in 2015 with the refugee crisis. People saw that New Zealanders might care about increasing the quota somewhat, and they became a little more interested in speaking out and not feeling vulnerable and them being the voices for it. So there was a particularly key meeting in Auckland in 2015 with the refugee background organisations. At that point, again, these were still tough meetings. These were a lot of questions about our capacity to increase the quota and about, well, we didn't have as many questions about who was speaking on behalf of who, because we had done this work with changemakers and we had individuals within the community helping us. So Rez Gardi is there standing in Geneva with her Double the Refugee Quota t-shirt. She was, I think, Young New Zealander of the Year last year for her work working with young refugees in New Zealand. And we'd also had guest speakers at my public talks around that time from refugee communities. So there were these individual links, but refugee-led organisations were still shy of it. Most of that, I mean, can anyone guess why they would be shy a year after the government cut half of the funding to strengthening refugee voices? I mean, was anyone here a part of an organisation that lost funding under the national government and had that? Massey, maybe? I don't know. Maybe. There was definitely, at least in some of the NGO spheres around in Wellington, a palpable fear of criticising them. There were a number of organisations, the Problem Gambling Foundation and a few others, who had their funding cut when they spoke out. So this was sort of the climate around there. I wouldn't say necessarily a climate of fear, but of reluctance to speak out. But we did have a lot of refugee background individuals working with us on the campaign. So this is cycling forward a little bit. These are pictures from the nationwide tour I did last year to a whole bunch of places with this really, really big piece of core flute, getting politicians to sign up to saying they support doubling New Zealand's refugee quota. So we had all sorts of, yeah, I mean, Goris Garaman's probably the most well-known, but Anne Beaglehole fled Hungary in 1956 and came to New Zealand and is now New Zealand's leading refugee historian. Another notable one is Karam Shah at the top there in the middle, spoke at Parliament. He fled Syria in 2011. He was part of the uprising against Assad in Aleppo and managed to get out early on and joined us at Parliament for this moment. You know, he got to stand up there and criticise the government from the steps in front of Parliament, which was, he said, was an amazing moment for him at the time to be able to stand up. Whereas, 6 years earlier, people were being shot just for protesting in the streets. So we had a lot of support from refugee background people. We actively connected with them whenever I would speak in public, and they would talk a little bit about why the campaign needed to succeed, why the quota needed to be doubled, but also why the support needed to be increased for refugee background communities. One point in this work, so a lot of this work is coming together around work Mohan and I are going to do for a white paper, sort of considering this particular moment in time in New Zealand's refugee resettlement strategy, where we're we have the potential to reconfigure some of these strengthening refugee voices policies. So one of the interesting ways to look at New Zealand, what we do, is always to compare with Australia. So their organisations are much larger and better established, but they have been politicised into independence. Asylum seekers and refugees in the last election by the ABC Vote Compass device was considered the second most important issue in the country, which is, like, from our point of view, that's like, okay, you know, if refugee issues in New Zealand, that'd be outside the top 10, I would say. Maybe migration would make the top 10. So there's been this degree of politicisation where people can no longer accept government funding or don't look for it simply because the government sucks that much. And so these prominent voices have come through. I've put the annual budgets of each one of these groups up here to kind of give a sense of their contrast to New Zealand. Most of the New Zealand ones operate on about $300,000 a year, at least the Changemakers in Auckland. Resettled Community Coalition, so many acronyms. RISE is refugees and detainees and survivors. Refugees, survivors and ex-detainees. They're probably the most radical of Australian groups, and they've currently got a campaign to boycott Australia as part of the response to their treatment of refugees on Nauru and Manus Island. Completely refugee-led employees as well as their board. Not the most money, but $310,000 a year. But they've got quite a high profile for such a small organisation. And part of that comes down to their tactics and their willingness to argue with some of the better funded refugee background organisations. To be more militant, basically, to take a stronger line. Then you've got the Australian Refugee Council, 1.5 million, who are a little bit between the government. They're kind of relied on a little bit by the government, but the politicisation, I hate using that word actually, what is it? It's not politicisation that's occurred there. What do you think, Mohan? The challenge, it's beyond politicisation. I don't know. The mess of Australia has basically meant that they have to stand back and not take government funds anymore. They're still able to be interviewed on the media as somewhat of a generic spokespeople group, but it is pretty much does not necessarily represent refugee voices in the same way that RISE does. And I think, the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre is kind of a dynamo in the area. A huge amount of funding goes into it. They've got the charismatic... does anyone know this organisation from social media? I feel like they're all over it. Their fundraising is exceptional. They get a huge amount of money now, all outside of the government, all outside that funding. They do a little bit of catering and other work, but mostly it's some fundraising that happens every year, which has brought them up to this position of 10 million Australian dollars. So what I'm thinking a little bit about, and what some other people in this sector is thinking about, Australia's 4.8 times the size of New Zealand, something like that, 5 times we'll say. If we had an organisation like the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre that was New Zealand-wide, representing refugee backgrounds, that would have a budget of $2 million. Is there a potential for all that to be raised in New Zealand? Is there a way that, without necessarily the politicisation around these issues, there could be an organisation created that has the support of the New Zealand public to advocate at that level? I mean, we have organisations here like Amnesty International, and their budget is something like 3.6 million this year. So something smaller than that, but still having that kind of reach. These are some of the sort of potentials that we might think of for at least refugee-oriented, if not refugee-led organisations. So the challenges ahead, all of these organisations, when they had their funding cut and when the national government was cutting funds of people who criticised them, moved away from research and advocacy to service provision. And groups like Doing Our Bit, groups like the Asylum Seeker Equality Project in Wellington, sort of formed up out of other loose alliances to do more of this advocacy work. There's a question of moving ahead with a larger quota, whether there is a potential for some of this research and advocacy to come back, whether that's under funding from the government or whether that's from just a larger pool of people being in the country and a larger number of areas people are being resettled in. The second sort of challenge, I don't even know why I put this under challenges. Challenges, opportunities, it's a kind of a poorly labelled SWOT analysis. There are new resettlement centres opening. So currently there's 7 or 8 around the country. Invercargill just opened up this year. Christchurch is restarting like next month. Dunedin opened up, and then we've got Auckland, Palmerston North Nelson, the Waikato and Auckland. Auckland's not taking many at the moment because of housing, but we're going to have another 5 or 6, the government has said. So there's a situation, and this is really the crux of it for me, why I'm interested in this. We're going to have 5 or 6 new areas, maybe Whanganui, maybe New Plymouth, maybe Tauranga. They're going to have refugees resettled in this area with very little of their own community there, and these will be slowly built up. How are people going to put in place institutions, or not even institutions, just collectives or communities that are able to speak back about the localized needs of these people in these new areas? What's the role of the state in that? And what's the role of things like strengthening refugee voices, which has traditionally been the mode whereby the government sort of used these people to try and form some sort of connection, to somehow understand what's going on. So that's really more of an opportunity, I think. Maybe it's a challenge. It's a little bit of both. I mean, it's not going to be good for the government if they've doubled the quota and some of these resettlement centres don't work out, or they have media about people not being happy being settled in, I don't know, somewhere small or somewhere big that they can't get a house in. But there are also some interesting opportunities coming up with 2015. There was a buoyancy I was seeing around the refugee sector, the organisations that worked with refugees, but also groups like Changemakers. There was this like a really strange thing for them to feel like the country cared. For the first time, at least in my life, that I've been here, that people cared about refugee protection, and volunteer numbers were through the roof, and fundraising was coming in from other places. So that led to all sorts of other interesting projects. There's been increasing work with iwi in some of the places where the community or refugee-led community organisations exist. So in Wellington, Changemakers Refugee Forum started a tikanga project, bringing local iwi together with resettled communities. And these are usually not people in the first couple of years in the country, but often people who have been there for a little while, who are a little bit grounded, but don't necessarily have that sense of place. And then in Dunedin with the health provision, there was also work with a local Maori health provider there, and refugees were going through them. So there's some interesting stuff going on. Dr. J. Marlowe has just got a Rutherford Fellowship, and part of that is looking at how in Auckland, different iwi, I think it's Ngāti Whātua is going to be working on. With him, well, hopefully, if we can get it together, on establishing some of these connections. And Tiana was probably the first one at the back of the room to write with me on this, on some of the relationships between Manakatanga and refugees coming to the country and what hospitality means. There was a really nice piece by Moana Maniapoto as well, where she talks about how a lot of refugees that come into New Zealand have more similar either like cosmology or tribal structures, relationships, or relationships just to the earth compared to Maori than they do to Pākehā. And so there's a lot of exciting opportunities that has begun to be institutionalised on the side of various places. Or maybe it's not even institutionalised, maybe it's just things that have come up out of need. There's also an extension from government, from MB, mostly focusing on refugee resettlement, to the Ministry of Social Development. It looks like they're taking on work past the 1-year mark, past when the Red Cross's contract sort of passes, and then it moves on to a broader community. I'm just actually back after a year of being away, so I'm catching up on exactly what has happened in this area. There's that confidence in these refugee-led organisations that I haven't seen before. There's despondency I would say 5 years ago, and then like a fear that these organisations wouldn't continue to last. And then there's a sense amongst some people that an opportunity with just a larger number of people, we might get this nationwide refugee background organisation that could speak with and to these issues. This is, yeah, I hummed and hawed about whether the resolution would come up on this picture. This is what the political situation was like before I left the country. This is where the parties were at. This was the number of people they wanted to bring in. That was the political weather. I was going to say climate before, but this is more of a weather forecasting than necessarily a climatological survey. This is where the Double the Quota campaign got to. I deregistered that charitable trust about 2 weeks ago and gave all our money away, which wasn't a lot of money, but gave a little bit to Peace Action Wellington and Asylum Seeker Equality Project so they could keep doing their work, because our job was over with that campaign. Because now we're in a different political situation, and one that I think still needs a lot of thought about where things are at. Labour, like this is kind of the pragmatic point for like the politics nerds who follow it far too much and are probably on Twitter right now. This is a sort of question of what Labour needs to make them seem good to the refugee communities beyond doubling the quota. So they campaigned at the last election on reducing immigration, and part of that way to say that that wasn't a racist policy. I wouldn't say it's a central reason for them doubling the quota, but I think it was certainly a marketable proposition. If we're talking in politics in such a sort of realpolitik way, it was a marketable proposition that they were going to increase the refugee quota, and that showed that they had a broad multicultural outlook. So now we're in a situation where they're in government with Mr. Winston Peters and the Green Party. And it's hard to know what will happen apart from at that sort of MB and MSD level over the next couple of years. But if we're thinking about the potential for these refugee-led organisations, I think we also need to think of what the different political parties want and how they want to be seen going into the next election. I mean, what is it, 2 years away? So it's maybe too early to be thinking about this, but if we're planning about particular asks and particular funding, and if I can wear my campaigner hat and my politics hat less than my critical theory or deconstructionist hat, then this is what excites me. Excites me about if it was the third Labour government that decided to give a bunch of money to set up these organisations for the first time in our history, what can we wrangle out of Ian Lees-Galloway next time? Or whoever's immigration minister. I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna, I got into this with my uncle at the weekend. God, it's a family event, you know how it goes. Yeah, he'll still be immigration minister. He's very good. I like him a lot. So this is a sort of point where I'll go back to this because this is Palmerston North and able to bring it back to the street. I put that in there because people seem to like pictures in this. Actually, that's my undergraduate classes. You guys are probably beyond that. So from a campaigner's view, I kind of see this as a sign of a place of divergent possibilities. The Strengthening Refugee Voices program is, I think, for changemakers down to about 50K a year in funding out of a budget, which is about 4 times that. So it is not what it was. It's not the main funding source. And if that disappeared, what would that look like? They would lose some money, but then they would gain the independence of not having funds from the government. It's a little bit like the university, right? The university is funded somewhat by tuition and a lot by the government, but we pretty much always feel like we're responsible and beholden to the government. Well, maybe to the consumers, to the students too. Anyway, bad analogy. So I feel like there's this divergent possibility at this time, and maybe there's organizations that can go either way on this. There could be a campaign and there could be pressure to strengthening refugee voices and to maybe make it more aligned with the needs of these well-established refugee-led organizations. That would probably and hopefully involve mentoring from the more established organizations in Auckland and Wellington, Palmy and Waikato to these new places to help them just establish the real basics of setting up hui and information sessions. And there could be some really amazing, interesting work done there if it was based on a more Like if we talk of democracy as being that radical form where it's the people who are working in it who choose and make the decisions on it, there is real possibility there that we could wrangle some money out of whatever the next iteration of a centre-left government is to make this really powerful and strong, to fund a nationwide group like the Australian Refugee Council, or to embolden the ones we already have. There's always going to be problems with this, but at a meta level, this is one of the potentials of lobbying, both with the Greens, I would say, and with Labour. I mean, talking about I haven't talked about National at all. It is easier to get things through. I mean, National won't be in power for another 20 years anyway, so they don't matter so much. See, I didn't used to be able to say this, so this is why I take the opportunity to to be a little gleeful. There are really strong opportunities I'll get into tomorrow of working with the opposition parties, which is why the campaign succeeded. And tomorrow when we're talking, if people are here for the workshop, then we can strategize about how you would do the same campaign or a different campaign with National as the opposition, and how you would try and use them, whatever wedge issues they're interested in. And the refugee quota is one of those wedge issues. And then the alternative, of course, is to follow that Australian model. And this is something people would consider, I think, within some of the sector. If the funding isn't there, if the government didn't show a genuine interest in helping people actually lead these organisations themselves and have control over it, then there's a potential for some of them to say, okay, we no longer want your Strengthening Refugee Voices funds. We will go on our own with our other fundraising models, thanks for the funding, and we'll take on a stronger advocacy voice. So this is sort of, I mean, it's really hard to know what's going to happen in the broader international environment around refugee issues. It would be so easy, I think, to have New Zealand replicate exactly what's happened in Australia. If we had a boat arrive with 300 asylum seekers from a Muslim majority country, I have no doubt that the New Zealand public would get whipped into a frenzy against them, and we would be in a really different situation than we are now. So there's always this kind of, at the very least, negotiating power for refugee-led organisations to say, our voices are powerful, you need our voices, and if you're going to fund them with strings attached, well, maybe that won't be something we always accept. I think I'll leave it there. So there's a workshop tomorrow, which is on sort of different stuff. This is more going to be on the background of starting a campaign and not getting depressed about it, especially when you don't get the Herald publishing your op-eds, which they didn't for a number of years. And actually they don't now as well, but that was my mistake. And then a little bit on all sorts of other fun things like the Official Information Act. Has anyone done an Official Information Act request? Yeah, they're pretty fun. And there's a lot of tools for these as well, getting yourself noticed. Around the launch of the book, I wrote kind of like a mock dating guide for getting to know the minister of your dreams. But no one wanted to publish it. And it was kind of about these techniques to get yourself known to a politician. So we'll be doing some more of that stuff tomorrow. And I mean, as a workshop, it'll be more interactive. And then on Friday, Mohan and I will be launching the white paper, thinking more about the relationship of the state to both refugees, resettled people, and the various sort of configurations of left, right, centre, and whatever the top party is. So I guess if there's anything people want to say, yes?
Yes, question. Thank you for that, that was awesome. I've got a question on voices that you had up before, and I know later on you said that you're working with Māori for resettlement refugees, but with my radical Māori hat on today, well I suppose it's awesome. A Pākehā hat, not good I suppose, but anyway with my radical Māori hat on, ever since the first boatload of economic refugees or asylum seekers came from England in the late 70s, early 1800s, Māori have never really had a voice about who's coming into the country. So we had boatloads and boatloads of British economic refugees right up till now, and now we've got these refugees coming. Now I'm not anti-British refugees or any refugees, but what kind of consultation process has happened with iwi across the country in terms of the Double the Quota campaign?
Right. I guess the first So there has been, well, I wouldn't say with iwi. So the Double the Quota campaign I started with all my friends who are also here with me today. So it was a very grassroots DIY thing. The consultation was talking to Maori friends about what they thought. And generally, there's a lot of mixed views on it, on migration. There's also a lot of that sliding between the notion of immigration and refugees. Like economic refugees are migrants, I guess. I mean, to be a refugee, you have to be persecuted, right? So yeah, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was persecuted and had to leave Ireland, but he had sort of a choice of where he was going to, and he came to New Zealand. Even the term economic refugees is used by the far right in Australia to deny that people are fleeing persecution. So one of the things is to say that, is to try and sort of connect to concepts of protection, of people who are genuinely, like their lives are at risk, and to see how small that is in the broader migration issue. So I wasn't trying to get in to discuss broader trends of migration.
On that persecution, so the 1951 Convention,
Yeah.
right, defines refugee as persecuted.
Or fear of persecution also,
Yes.
yeah.
On that grounds, people who are displaced because of famine, like the millions in Africa, are not able to be refugees under the UN and under
Yeah.
that convention. Therefore, what we are bringing in refugees who may die because they're being persecuted or fear of persecution, but we say, sorry, Black African, you can't come because you're starving, you're going to die anyway. What's been done for them to change their status to be refugees?
Yeah, to be a refugee, you also have to have crossed an international border. So it's about, generally it's persecution from the state, or the state is so weak that it can't protect you. So in terms of, if we're talking about famine as environmental, as an environmental catastrophe that leads into persecution, generally it creates a conflict in those areas as well, civil war, where people are considered refugees. The reason Black Africans don't come to New Zealand anymore was a policy by the national government in 2009. Although, I mean, to be fair, it was introduced by Don McKinnon in 1992 that we started taking people from Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, South Sudan. It's kind of an interesting one because it also connects up with the notion of the climate refugee, the person who has to leave because of this environmental situation. Generally, that often leads to conflict that allows them to be considered under the UNHCR Convention a refugee. But in terms of famine, like, there is a very substantial New Zealand aid budget which is supposed to go to this, although that has also been reprioritised in different directions. I mean, you don't want to become a refugee who's fled the country. The aim would be, if there is famine, to have funding and food to go there and to prevent that rather than getting out of the state. When I say the state, the kind of, this protection you're supposed to have in the country you're in. To be a refugee, to cross that border is really the last approach to it. To go back to the question around Maori consultation, I wouldn't say I consulted any large groups. I talked to individual people who I knew in activist communities and other people who I knew around already and asked them what they thought about it. But I'm not at the level of bringing people into the country and making sure they settle well. I'm the one waving a flag and shaking a stick. So while I talked to those individuals, it was much like working with the refugee background people. I talked to individuals about it, what they thought. But yeah, I mean, it's super interesting to see how my friends from Maori backgrounds, well, not from Maori backgrounds, anyway, the range of positions. And I mean, often it came back to manakatanga when people felt that connection, but when the story was when the connection wasn't there between the displacement of Maori within New Zealand. Like, there's a really interesting, and Beaglehole's history to refugees in New Zealand. The very first chapter talks about displacement. So not people who have to leave the country, but people who are forced off their land. And so she talks about, colonization and invasion as the very first step of doing any history of refugee issues in New Zealand. And when that's the framing, we're in a communication department here, when that's the framing of it, you get a different narrative to the narrative that I hear more regularly when people think that, I don't know, like any immigrant is a refugee. There's sort of it's kind of a different, like in Auckland, for example, at the moment, we have about 90 people resettled there a year, only 90. So that's what, like 30 families, 25 families? And yet people are up in arms about refugees going to Auckland. There just aren't really that many. So there's kind of, I don't know, there's the same kind of information sharing process, the kind of education process that has to go on for all folk. Yeah. I mean, if I could have done the campaign again and had resources, I mean, I would have hired someone, you know. For me, it was voluntary time for almost all of the 5 years. So, yeah.
I'll let you pass on this one.
Yeah. Thanks. Hey, Murray.
Oh, hi, Murdoch. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your conversation with us today. I was a little bit interested, particularly about the Manawatu, because I was involved in some things there, and it comes back to the title of your presentation about for and by, because I instantly recognise that as the for, by and about ethos that sits around things like community access radio. And then you mentioned Ian Lees-Galloway, and I remembered that on the particular station I was involved with, he was a frequent contributor. But what I'd like to say is, there were two areas in terms of what I call established refugee voices that you hadn't kind of mentioned, and I didn't know whether they were wrapped up in other things or you saw them as potentially ineffectual. And that was community access radio, where refugees can speak in their own voice to their own communities. And the second one is the multicultural councils, which exist in a number of places, particularly the Manawatu and in Nelson. And the way in which they provide a voice as people establish, that's more about retaining identity and communicating from a point of identity rather than the assimilation processes that the MBs and, SIFs, all those abbreviations are involved in, and what your commentary is about that.
No, those are really good points. Those are areas I didn't canvass in the talk. And I did work with various community access radio. There were connections in the Waikato where I spoke on one of those radio stations in a slot around this, and with the Multicultural Council. So they didn't initially come to mind because they're a broader base, and maybe they don't have the same, well, they probably have similar challenges, but not necessarily the same ones about this very specific Strengthening Refugee Voices program from, I don't know who to say it's from the Clark government. So, yeah.
So rather than leave you struggling for words, I'll extend it to the Refugee Council of New Zealand and their role in your vision.
Yeah, I haven't had a lot to do with them. I think it's a lot of the organisations don't have the funding necessary to perform necessarily the role that they would like to be able to perform. And yeah, and I think that's probably a basis of the lack of funding over the last 9 years. But also it's been challenges for these organisations. A lot of the Strengthening Refugee Voices funds went to the community ones, or almost all of it. So it feels like, from my perspective, they don't have, because they don't have the very specific community that they're tied to in the place where the funding is, they don't have the new people coming in and the need for services like the driver training, that it's a little harder to get traction in those groups. Occasionally I see them commenting in the media on things on this area, but nowhere near with the kind of ferocity or regularity of the Australian organisations. Yeah.
Thanks, Murdoch.
Yeah.
I expected it to be an awkward question. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on it. I've got to go, but thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thanks, Murray. Yeah, I mean, the whole campaign is, we're almost done. There's a lot of shortcomings in the campaign, and as an academic I like to look at shortcomings, but it's also something to be shy of when you're an activist. But now that it's done, you know, there are challenges. Nothing's perfect in it, and some of the kind of real challenges of doing ethical work or trying to do ethical work is seeing that, yeah, some stuff doesn't go to plan. Some stuff you didn't do it right from the start. But maybe that's what we can work on in a workshop tomorrow.
Particularly for me that stands out is that not all refugee voices are united, and the voices of those who might have come here 50 years ago versus the Rohingya who are here today, or the Bhutanese communities that arrived a few years ago. Quite often there is a lot of, not tension I would say, but differing opinions in between those groups.
Yeah, and tension, definitely.
For us to assume that all refugee voices are united and then they'll then have one overarching organization that will then put the refugee voice out there, it's a little bit, you know, it's not really realistic in some situations. They come from such different backgrounds and different parts of the world that it's really hard.
Yeah, it's a real
Certainly
challenge.
There are, of course, a huge amount of similarities and the shared experience of being refugees, but we're assuming that they all have the same opinion.
Yeah.
They often don't.
I mean, the clashes are around particular resources like the, you know, which communities are favoured to be brought into the country more, who is getting access to family reunification. So there are like genuine resource questions about how these disparate groups can get on, which is why it's an interesting challenge and why more academic work and more community work needs to sort of think through some of this, but also to find those, where you can unite. Sound like the Democrats or something, where we can work together. Yeah.
You know, Murdoch, one thing which is so amazing about this campaign is its effectiveness. So from a pragmatic standpoint, this is an excellent exemplar of a successful campaign. Therein comes the negotiation though, you know, between being a critical theorist and wanting to make change. So I wonder if there are points where you get frustrated with the constant picking at and questioning, and at the same time the pragmatic need to achieve things and move on and to actually see transformations.
Yeah, I mean, I would extend the picking at the kind of critical side of things to the Twitter sphere and Facebook. Well, although one of the joys, like, you know, I'll talk about the stages of the campaign last time. One of the joys was in what I call the last stage, the conservative success stage. People were telling us we weren't asking for enough. And there was something a little bit sort of satisfying about that. To be like, you know, in the radical stage, people were telling us this is ridiculous, it'll never happen. So there's kind of like a strange little joy in constancy. And I don't think academics are the worst, they're the smartest, which makes the questions interesting. And if you pair that to social media, these are questions that I'm genuinely interested in. And so I kind of, maybe if I was a campaigner from a different background, I would feel more, I don't know, to me they're legitimate, strong questions that come through and that make it interesting. It was also more difficult before they doubled the quota. You know, there's some justification in having got it to 1,500 places with, you know, and not just us, obviously. There was a lot of organisations that came together and we, you know, worked together through time, but yeah. And, you know, the last year, the focus has been on academic publishing and creating the kind of little legacy things like this to try and tease out some things. Like, there must be some theory. You know, you look through the reference list and the resources. There's some good theory in this too.
Your philosophical underpinning critical theory, are you referring to Frankfurt School or Habermas? Critical theory is a broad overview.
Yeah, I mean, with the contemporary critical theory, I like Peter Sloterdijk's reading on it, even though I don't like some of his politics, which is a critique of the sort of social mood created by the third wave of Frankfurt School people, the kind of morbidity and melancholy. But I do mean more broadly in terms of small c, small t critical theories. Yeah, all that good stuff. Not that much underwrites this. There's some Chantal Mouffe that I find really powerful in a political lens. I thought Zizek's book on refugees was good from a sort of meta-political level, even if he got quite a bit wrong in terms of the factual stuff. Yeah. There's some other good. There's a whole lot of good theory out there. That, yeah. Don't let me geek out on theory. That'll be a. We'll put that in the white paper. Yeah. So I think.
Thank you so much for that.
Okay. Thanks.